this story doesn't end in 2 weeks when news reporters go home. The people of Flint are going to be dealing with these effects for a lifetime for some of these children. Hi, I'm Kayla Ruble. I'm a reporter here with Vice News. Over the last few weeks, Flint, Michigan has been in headlines across the country after it was revealed that the city's water system was contaminated with lead. I was out in Flint last week to check out what was going on, and I'm here right now to answer all of your questions. What do we got?
We've got a lot of questions for you, Kayla. We've got some people on Skype, and we're going to go ahead and start with Jonathan, who's calling us from Grand Blanc, Michigan, which is actually just a couple minutes outside of Flint.
Yeah, I've been to Grand Blanc. Great.
Hey, Jonathan.
How you doing? Okay, so from an outsider's perspective, where should the people of Flint, Michigan be placing the blame for the water crisis?
Right, that's a great question. I mean, so for anyone who's not following or who is kind of new to what's going on, this is a saga that's been playing out over the last year, and it's going on. You know, the citizens have been complaining over the last year, worried that there was something wrong with their water, and we've seen everyone from local officials to state officials to local, state, and even national agencies like the EPA, sort of their blame questioned in this. And I think it's right that when you have more than 30,000 homes in a major American city at risk for lead contamination, that people want to look for someone to blame. Unfortunately, though, it's only been over the last few weeks that there's emails coming out from the governor's office. A lot of FOIA requests are finally being answered, and we're starting to get a little more insight into how this all happened. And I think, unfortunately, we're not going to know for a few more months exactly, who's to blame. But I definitely think, this was a political decision. This was, there were some definite errors that were made when what happened was when the city of Flint decided to switch its water system from Detroit water to its own river, to the Flint River. And there were some mistakes made in how to treat the water. And because that water ended up being quite corrosive, it leached the pipes on its way into people's homes and took lead with it. So I think we're still, we're trying to put together all the pieces of how this happened, what the timeline was, who knew what, when they knew it, and how high up can we go to place blame. And I think, as right now, where people are really just trying to patch some of the, sort of put a Band-Aid on the problem, get fresh water to the people of Flint who cannot drink the water in their homes. And then I think at the same time, there's this sort of parallel effort to figure out how this happened and how do we prevent this from happening again. So, unfortunately, I can't really speculate who exactly is to blame. But I think, this is going to come out over the series of the next couple of months, what kind of officials and what policies led to this.
And how can the city capitalize off of the 15 minutes of fame? Because this is it's the first time in a long time where people are actually paying attention, other than it being the most dangerous city in America,
right,
and a bunch of other bad things.
Right, I think that's a great point. And, I talked to people about this. I talked to almost everyone about this in my conversations last week. Because, right, as you point out, Flint has had a rough couple of decades. They've lost thousands of jobs as the auto industry has tanked, and they've seen their crime rate skyrocket. They're constantly, noted as one of the most dangerous cities in the country. And then all of a sudden you get this. You get their entire water system is contaminated with lead. You have an entire generation of kids whose health is going to be affected as a result. So it's quite easy to look at this and say, wow, one more kind of, depressing thing happening to Flint. But maybe there's a way to actually use this to turn things around, or to at least, as you said, capitalize on the 15 minutes of fame. And I think, I heard a couple of different things from residents while I was there. One being that everyone in Flint, it's a tough city. These people have been through a lot and they're resilient. So this will just be another example of that. And you can see that in all the activism that has sort of bubbled up around this. People were consistently told over the last year by their state, elected officials that their water was fine. And they knew that wasn't the case, and they joined together and pushed back and pushed back. So you see that, and I think that's sort of giving an interesting vibe to the city right now, sort of this coming together. People are out at water centers, people are seeing their neighbors, people are talking to each other, all of that sort of thing. So, there's that side. I've also heard, from local businessmen and investors in Flint itself, and then also in other parts of the state. And there is a lot of talk of, how can we bring in more investment, and then we're going to have to bring in all these services because they're going to have to fix the lead piping. They're going to have to take care of these children who now are at risk for behavioral issues and all these other health effects from lead, and we're going to have to bring in experts and all of this stuff. So maybe there's a way that we can sort of use this to also bring back investment and bring in kind of a renewed resiliency and renewed sort of energy to the city. I think that's people trying to be optimistic. We'll have to see if that actually happens, but I think it's it's definitely a possibility.
All right.
Cool, thank you.
Jonathan, thanks for coming on the show. So, Kayla, we're actually getting a bunch of tweets.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I know, Twitter. So, what a novel concept. Here's one from James at Queer as Poetry. Kayla, how long will it take to replace all the lead pipes in Flint, Michigan?
I think before we talk about that question, the question is, are we going to replace the lead pipes in Flint, Michigan? The governor just said this week in an interview that this wasn't an imminent this wasn't something he was looking at doing in the imminent future, and which is concerning to a lot of people. I mean, I was talking to people last week that are like, why aren't these lead pipes being replaced? When is that going to start happening? But I think, as Governor Rick Snyder of Michigan has been, saying over and over again, his focus right now is getting people clean water, which is all well and good. But I do think, down the road, people want they want a bigger fix for this problem. And the lead pipes have been, no one's really actually sure how severe the damage is to the pipes, but we know that it's there. And it's going to cost millions of dollars to fix, and it will take some time. It's something like, there's thousands of, pipelines throughout the city that may need to be replaced. And I think that's going to be a question we'll have to see. How long will it take? I think, but the bigger question is, when are we going to decide to start looking at that, and who's going to pay for it?
That's a great question to be asking.
Yeah.
It's almost like you're a journalist. So,
Trying.
Speaking of questions, I know Gabe is on Skype, and he's got
great.
some questions for you. So let's say to Gabe.
Well, my question was in regards to the emergency manager law that seems to be at the center, or at least what a lot of people are pointing to.
Right.
And my question was, since everybody has a lot of complaint about this law, why is it that, or can they challenge the law in court? And if they can't, why can't they?
Mm-hmm. So I'll try to do a brief summary of the emergency manager law, because I know it gets thrown out in sentences a lot in these articles, and maybe not everyone's super familiar with it, but it's a great question to ask. So there's a law in Michigan passed a couple decades ago, but then was sort of revamped when Governor Snyder came in 2011. And this act allows the state to put in what's called an emergency financial manager in either a city or a school system. And sort of the idea is they're supposed to become the kind of like all-powerful official of that city, and their main aim is to balance the budget. So what we saw in a lot of cities over the last few years are selling, privatizing public parks, municipal golf courses. We also see cutting of, pensions and that sort of thing in ways to balance budget everywhere from Detroit to Flint and all across the state. So that's what happened in Flint. When the water was switched from Detroit to Flint, there was an emergency manager in control. And because the emergency manager was in control, he was able to sign off on, yep, we're going to start using the Flint River, and we're going to go ahead with building our own water authority. Because he was able to make that decision, there was no need there, and he sort of at the time, I guess he's overtaking all the powers of the local officials. There were no public meetings, there were no public hearings, there were no votes, there was no city council vote on this. He just signed off on it. So that's why a lot of people have, pointed to this law as like, okay, the city wasn't even able to make their own decision in this. This was essentially someone acting in the state capacity making this decision. Now, when we talk about this law and why people or how people might be able to repeal this has been a super controversial law. There's been groups pushing back against it since it was passed. And actually, after it was passed in 2011, there was a public referendum that shot down the law. But then the legislature was able to come in and repass it. There's some sort of loopholes in Michigan lawmaking that allows this to happen, and so it was passed anyways, and the emergency manager was given these powers. There have been attempts to file lawsuits against it. Most of these lawsuits have been either rejected or stripped down. There's one currently that has been allowed to continue on the basis that the policy could be discriminatory because a majority of the citizens in cities run by emergency managers are Black. So there's been sort of a racial issue pointed to this. That's the only part of these lawsuits that have been allowed to proceed. Basically the only step to get rid of this law, though, it seems, is going to be legislative action in the state. And Democratic lawmakers have pushed forward a law in the last few days to get this done. But there's a supermajority in Michigan's legislature made up of on the Republican side, and they're tend to be in favor of this emergency manager law. So it will be interesting to see whether this gets passed or not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Gabe, thanks for coming on, man. Appreciate you tweeting in and ending up on the show. Well, speaking of tweets, Kayla, we got another one. Here's go figure. Here's Frederick. Frederick says, I'm from Sweden, so I haven't really heard about the water situation. Is it actually life-threatening to drink the water there in Flint? So basically, Frederick's wondering what happens if you drink the water.
Right. So I think that's, obviously that's what probably a lot of people are wondering. I think, if you drink the water, do you immediately keel over and die? No, that's probably not the case. But over the last year, people have been seeing brown and yellow water coming out of their taps. You have residents complaining of rashes, losing hair, people attributing this everything from killing their plants to killing their dogs. But unfortunately, not enough has really been analyzed to figure out, we haven't had the capacity to connect all of these issues. When someone had a rash on their leg, was that because of their water or was that because of something else? But what we do know right now are the lead levels are too high in the water. They surpass legal, guidelines and recommendations. And the scariest part about this is that when a child is exposed to high amounts of lead, whether it's in water or paint chips, this immediately can affect their their childhood development, and this will affect them throughout the rest of their lives. So that's sort of it's actually the medium and long term that's really scary, is that we're going to have to monitor this, cohort of children for the foreseeable future in a city where children are already start off with a pretty rough outlook on life. So that's sort of all we can really tell at this point. I mean, I think there's been some recent linkage to a Legionnaire's outbreak in Flint to the water. So we're starting to see some of these other illnesses surface, and I think it'll be interesting to see, I guess, what the direct connections are between all of these, and if we start to see more as we learn additional details about the water supply.
Great, Frederick. I hope you've been enlightened. So, Kayla, thanks for answering that.
Hopefully I helped.
Either way, let's go ahead and say to Russ. He's Skyping in as well. He's in Miami.
Great.
And we're jealous. Hey, Russ.
Yeah, hi, Russ.
Hi, guys. Hi, Kyla. Thanks so much for all your great reporting on this.
Well, thanks.
I have a political question for you.
Okay.
Why do you think it is that President Obama hasn't declared Flint a disaster area? And do you think that there's some partisan politics that are underlying all of the response to the crisis?
Right. Yeah, those are important points to be asking about. I think people were a little disappointed last week when Obama came to Flint, and I think they were kind of hoping came to Detroit, and I think they were hoping he might come to Flint. He did not. He stayed in Detroit, where he was talking about the coming back of the auto industry. But he did, talk about some of the problems that were happening in Flint, and he has sort of highlighted that some of the policy failures that led to this issue. At the same time, he's put millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars towards the emergency relief fund. But you're right, he hasn't declared this a major disaster. Now, Governor Snyder has repealed this decision, and there's been a lot of back and forth that it should be a major disaster, and whether that's a technical decision or whether that's a political decision is really, it's unclear. But I think it is an important point to note that the administration has been relatively quiet when talking about specifics of the Flint controversy, and they haven't really placed blame. They haven't really, talked about specific programs. But I know that federal officials have been in the state. They are working with local and state agencies, and so I think also part of this has to do with there's a lot we don't know. We don't know exactly what response is going to be needed. We don't know how much money is going to be needed, who's going to pay for it. It might depend, if the state ends up being at fault, or local officials, or is it going to show up on the tax bills of the citizens of Flint. So I have a feeling, I can't say for certain, but I'm sure as more information comes out, we might see, more solid action from state and national officials.
Great. Thanks, Kayla.
Thanks, Russ.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. And that's a very tropical plant you have. Yeah, Kayla. So let's go ahead and say hey to Peter. I know he is on Skype as well. So I bet he's got a stumper for you. Peter, you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, Kayla.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Thank you very much for all your reporting on this.
Oh, thank you.
So earlier you touched on the fact that it was difficult at this point to assign blame to start assigning blame to really get to the bottom of this. That right now the emphasis is really on fixing the problem and sort of sorting out who is responsible for it is something that comes at a later date. But I did see that Vice had published an article a few days ago about how the governors had released all these emails related to this ongoing crisis. And there's this 7-month gap where no emails about the water supply issue were released. And I'm curious, and I know I'm asking, soliciting conjecture, but I'm curious if you think that there really were no emails that during that period. And I guess as a follow-up, I have a follow-up, I guess, in no matter how you answer.
Okay. So I don't want to totally speculate on whether or not there were emails. I think, a lot of people are doing that right now. I think that 7-month gap is really, that months-long gap is, if there were no emails, it's concerning because that was the height of the problem. That's when you were seeing the highest lead level tests coming back. That's when people were starting to scream the loudest. That's when you were seeing hospital research coming back that were showing kids had high blood lead levels. So it's definitely something we're questioning, and we have been reporting on that. I think people are hoping that there's going to be answers coming in future emails or some of the other emails we're seeing from the state agencies. But if you are someone who thinks there was a higher level of neglect or knowledge at the state level, I also don't think we can rely on those answers coming through emails. And so it could go either way. Maybe there were emails sent or maybe there weren't. But unfortunately, we don't know because the Michigan Governor's Office is exempt from FOIA requests. So they get to decide what they put out and what they don't.
I see. So I'm a lawyer, and so I have dealt with FOIA before, and so I've sort of been seen behind the scenes as to the way that the government gets to sort of play fast and loose with what they choose to release, and it's only after often the most damaging things come out only after they're compelled to be done so by a judge. So you mentioned that the governor's office is exempt from FOIA requests and that they get to choose. But are there any avenues where they could be forced to be more candid in their and thorough in their disclosures?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, this is pretty unprecedented. This is a pretty unprecedented crisis for the state, and this is the first time we're seeing a governor, from my knowledge, the first time we're seeing a Michigan governor actually release his emails or conversations, because this is a longstanding law that the governor's office specifically is exempt. And so, again, they're just choosing to do this as sort of a kind of making good with the public. Look, we'll release our emails. I think what's going to be crucial in finding out the information we really want to know, it's going to come through, there's a congressional hearing next week where Governor Snyder will be testifying. There is Michigan's Attorney General has opened an investigation. And I think there's a couple lawsuits, federal lawsuits, that are being put into place. So I think through some of those avenues and, kind of evidence collecting and that sort of thing, we might see, hopefully that's where we'll see evidence coming to light, proving or disproving any theories people have about state culpability. And I think that's where we're going to see it. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to come through FOIAs at this point. We're getting great little details from these FOIAs that are putting the pieces together of the timeline. But when it comes to sort of the bigger picture of what actually happened, it might take these court cases and, congressional hearings and all of that to really find out, I think. But it's a great question. I mean, I think we're all waiting for it.
Sure. And I mean, it's just, that's tough because it's so difficult to prove, say I was injured and the cause of my injury was the contaminated water. So in order to sort of succeed on the merits and then getting them to admit to whatever ability, it just seems like if it happens at all, it's a long way away.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to end on. That's a great way to end this conversation. Is that, this is all of a sudden after a year of people pushing back, this is in national headlines and people are paying attention and we're focused on the emergency, getting people water. But this story doesn't end in 2 weeks when people go home and when news reporters go home and when the fervor starts to die down. The people of Flint are going to be dealing with these effects for a lifetime for some of these children and for years. And I think months down the road, we're going to still be having developments coming out of who knew what and who knew when. So it's going to be a developing situation, and we'll be covering it still on Vice News, and we'll be following the situation, and we hope that you guys will all follow it too.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, Peter, thanks for coming on. And Kayla, excellent shout out to Vice News there. I'm sure Jason Mojica, if he's watching right now, will be very happy. And you know what, with that, why don't we wrap up the show and
great.
say goodbye to everybody at home.
All right, bye. Thanks so much for tuning in. And yeah, as I said, continue to follow our coverage of the Flint water crisis on vicenews.com and check out the rest of our news coverage. And well, thanks so much.